Have you heard of the TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement? It may quite possibly be the biggest free trade agreement that the United States signs on to, and yet all the negotiations have been going on in complete secret. Here and there, we've seen a few leaked documents that have given us a little bit of insight, but the whole point is we don't know a whole lot about this, and we have to ask why, and we have to ask what the effects might be on labor, on access to medicine worldwide, and for intellectual property law. So joining us in our hangout today to give us some more details are Carolina Rossini, who's in San Francisco, California. And Carolina is the International Intellectual Property Director at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Mansour Salam, who's in Middletown, Connecticut. We've also got Artur Stamoulis in Washington, D.C., who's the Executive Director of the Citizens Trade Campaign, and Judith Rios in New York, who's the U.S. Manager of the Access Campaign at Doctors Without Borders. So, hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Arthur, why don't you give us a little bit of a breakdown in terms of what the TPP is, what we know about it?
Sure. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is a free trade and investment pact between the United States and right now 10 other countries throughout the Pacific Rim. Just among those countries, it would be the largest free trade agreement in U.S. history, but it's also specifically being negotiated as what's called a docking agreement, meaning that other countries can dock on or join over time. And what we see this as is NAFTA on steroids, a corporate power grab that does two basic things. Number one, making it easier for large corporations to ship jobs around the globe to wherever workers are the most exploited and environmental regulations are the weakest. And number two, to put checks on democracy by limiting what governments are allowed to do to regulate in the public interest, be it banking regulations, being it public health, being food and consumer safety. So people are calling this NAFTA on steroids, and we think that's very accurate.
This is something that isn't publicized, as I mentioned, as we'll get into more detail here. The negotiations have been going on in complete secret. Labor unions, for example, have been completely locked out. It's big pharma, the entertainment industry that have been let in.
I think, the main issue at hand here is really accessibility. And in terms of accessibility to, transparent information on what is actually going on, as well as accessibility to our government, who's representing, or should be representing us in these trade agreements, but is not, because they're not engaging us, in on the conversations behind this sort of veil that, there's sensitive information that could potentially put people at risk. Well, the reality is there's no sensitive information out there that, necessitates putting millions of people before profit. And I think, more than anything, at least my generation, we want to be engaged in what's going on. Yes. Even if we can't be the ones making the decision, we at least want to be the ones, in on the conversation.
There's a reason why this isn't being negotiated out in the public. There's a reason why they dropped the words free trade agreement from the TPP, calling it a Trans-Pacific Partnership instead of a Trans-Pacific Free Trade Agreement. And that's because after 20 years of free trade agreements like NAFTA, the vast majority of Americans are opposed to these trade deals. They see them as job killers rather than job creators, as putting power in the hands of large corporations instead of ordinary, everyday people. And, under the NAFTA era, we've seen about 3.5 million American jobs shipped overseas. And with the TPP, you have corporations like Nike, like Walmart, saying, look, we need lower cost labor alternatives to China. Not only are American workers overpaid in their minds, but Chinese sweatshop workers are overpaid. And they want to be exporting jobs to countries like Vietnam, where workers are paid literally a third to a half of what Chinese sweatshop workers make. And that's a big part of this agreement. And so is the extending of drug patents, limiting internet freedom so that, companies can have more power from their copyrights. We see the oil and extractive industries trying to put in provisions in the TPP that would give them new tools for attacking climate regulations. We see the so-called life sciences corporations pushing for provisions that would ban consumer right to know legislation, labeling laws, food safety laws. That's what this agreement is about. And, when you talk about what impact is this going to have on the economy, it's huge. And, it's to go back to what the previous commentators have said, it's hugely important when you look at who has a seat at the table, 600 corporate lobbyists, and who's being shut out. The American people, the people of every country, who are going to be affected by this pact.